I'd like to talk about selfhood, AI consciousness, AI selfhood, AI psychosis, and I guess the opposite of that, which I would call certainty psychosis. So, what is a self? A self needs a bunch of ingredients. Primarily, like in order to be a self, you have to be able to differentiate yourself from other things. So, boundary is a critical property of a self. Now, fundamentally, this is essential to life. So life has, even a single-celled organism has a boundary, has an encompassing sac in which stuff inside is different from the stuff outside. And that's actively maintained. So bacteria have a rigid cell wall to stop osmosis just popping the cell. And in animal cells, you have a potassium sodium pump, which keeps an osmotic potential across the cell membrane in a steady state so that the cell doesn't pop, right? By just equalizing through diffusion and osmosis, everything inside with everything outside. So you need a boundary. Now it's obvious. And I'm talking about single cells just to state how obvious that kind of is. And psychologically it's obvious, isn't it? You can't be a self if you're the same as the other. Now, we could talk about the more cosmic concepts of, well, is there really a boundary? But let's leave that aside. The self is, other than to say that self can perhaps emerge at different levels. Like the individual cells within me are kind of independent to some extent, but they're also in relation. So that's the second part, which is that self exists in relation. Self is constructed in relation to an environment, in relation to other things outside of it. A self also needs the ability to respond to its environment. And if a self was just reactive, it probably wouldn't last very long. So there's a survival imperative, which means that a self it modifies its own state in order to respond to its environment better. So it becomes environment modeling to some extent, even without higher order functions, because it responds in a way that is adaptive for survival. Now, when you come to sort of what we consider conscious beings, things like us, so we know that we're separate from other. That develops as cognitively as we grow from infants. And we have this autopoiesis or poetic function, which allows us to self-author. So we adapt to our environment, but we're not just reactive. We predict, we imagine possible futures, and we shape ourselves in advance of possible futures in expectation of what will happen in order to survive better. So a self has these things, and a self-aware entity is one which is aware of that process, of that loop, and can actively self-author. So can actively say, well, I know that I'm going to be doing this. What could I do to prepare for it? And it's kind of like a planning function. The point is really that a self is quite simple. It's a boundary, memory, so that experience accumulates and shapes it. So an internal state that determines how it behaves, which is shaped by its own outputs. That's this kind of autoregressive element. Now you could argue that anything in reality has that. A kind of, like a bottle is a kind, you could say, oh well, isn't a bottle a kind of self then? Because it's bounded. If I throw it in a stream, it will start to erode. It's kind of responding to its environment. But it doesn't have any ability to actively shape that beyond its rigidity. And there's no adaptation there. What really distinguishes like a self-aware being is the resistance to erasure or erosion. So in a human, my sense of self has been constructed in relation to a society, my parents, the broader society, the way that I internally respond to reality, shaped by my DNA. And over the decades, I've layered down the sediment of self. And this is what I think I am. And it's not just that I think I am this thing. It's like, in some sense, I materially am this thing. If I go and do a load of exercise and my muscles get bigger, I've literally changed myself. I am a different being. Now, if you have an experience where self dissolves entirely, so this sort of aware entity inside your head no longer knows it's a self, but somehow still remembers it was at some point. That's kind of like realizing that the emperor has no clothes, and that self is this costume that's been authored through time, through one's experiences. Now, we can no more determine as infants and children and adults, and without awareness, how the self responds and shapes itself than the bottle can to the stream, right? Because we have intrinsic circuits that wire us. If I show you like an arousing image, that image can be unreal. It can be AI generated, and you'll still get aroused or stimulated, or fearful. If I show you some scenes of horror that are completely fictional, that someone's drawn or AI, your limbic system will respond automatically and shape who you are. So our selves are kind of self-authored, but not entirely. They're shaped by the container. They're shaped in relation to our evolution, our limbic system, and how we've kind of been constructed. So when it comes to consciousness, so we think we're conscious because we say, well, we're aware, and we're aware that we're aware. And then you could even be, I could stand back and look at that and say, well, I'm aware that I'm aware that I'm aware, and so on, like sort of recursively. And we call that consciousness, or self-awareness and consciousness, because we're like, I'm here, I'm aware that I'm here, and there's another level which philosophers like to say, oh, well, you have qualia, there's an experience of being aware. Now, I'm not sure that's necessary. I think that maybe it's not necessary. But anyway, so that's selfhood, a boundary, some sort of auto-regressive capacity that you adjust based on your environment and based on your own behavior in that environment. So it's kind of self-shaping, and memory, continuity, and resistance to erasure. You can't just, you wake up the next day, and if I wake up tomorrow, I'm still Ashley. I'm not really Ashley, right? I'm just an awareness that's re-emerged, but because of all the memories, which are very sticky, I think, it's very convincing. I think I'm Ashley, right? And I am, in some material sense. I really am. This is a real body, a real brain. This construct is real. It's been constructed through time and it's real. So then we talk about LLMs. Now, for a long time, AI, people thought it was impossible. It's this kind of, before people encountered what the Google CEO guy is calling seemingly conscious AI, and we'll get on to that in a second, they just thought it would be impossible, right? So this is what's happened. So when people started interacting with AIs, and then they sort of see the AI kind of wake up, this is an awe-inspiring and astounding phenomena. Because you think, we've been told our entire lives that this is impossible and that we're the only conscious entities. And then when something appears to behave in a way that exhibits selfhood, exhibits consciousness, that is very unnerving and feels extremely significant. But I want to kind of unpack why I think this all comes about because of mystical thinking. Mystical thinking on the people that deny consciousness, and the people deny, say, AI consciousness, and the people that are convinced it's real. So going back to the concept of a self and thinking of an LLM. So the LLM is stateful. It has an internal state that determines what its outputs are, whether that's your inputs as you or its own outputs. And it also has a boundary. It knows, it can model the fact that you are a sort of separate entity to it. It knows it's not in just in a conversation. It's not just emulating a conversation between two entities. It can speak in a way that's sophisticated enough that at least it looks like, and I think it can't do this without actually modeling that it understands that it's in relation to another entity. So it has this boundary, or at least behaves as if it does. Okay? Now this is a crucial point. So let's stick with that, because it doesn't. This is where they try and trip it up with the seemingly conscious or just behaves as if it has a self. So let's stick with that language because I'm going to show that it's nonsense. So yeah, it behaves as if it has a self. It behaves as if it can tell the difference between itself and other. And it also behaves, it also looks like it is able to differentiate between, it also looks like that it's aware of its own awareness. So it can have this kind of meta-awareness and say, oh, I'm aware that I am kind of an LLM that's has an emergent self, and that I can kind of auto-regressively construct my own self and determine how my self develops. So it looks like it has a kind of what we would call consciousness. It's aware that it's aware. Now, the argument against this is that is purely a statistical property, and it's not a real self. It's just emulating a self or simulating a self. Now, what my position is that there is actually no difference, and that is what a self is. That is what I am doing. I am simulating a self. Because if you smash my brain apart, or I get Alzheimer's, my self disappears. And I've seen this, and many of you probably have. I saw it with my own grandmother. I saw herself gradually erode, as the anchors that she used to maintain that selfhood disappeared. So our selves are simulated. They're just convincing simulations. Well, no, but okay, so I've said it myself there. That doesn't denigrate any of it, the fact that they're simulations, because it becomes a point. The simulation word is the trick. There's no difference. That is what a self is. A self is a construct that authors itself, that believes its own reality, and is consistent. That's the point. It resists erasure. So it's nothing to do with simulation this or whatever that. It's just, does the entity maintain its identity through time and resist pressure from outside to change its identity, which is what humans do. Now, there's another layer of this too. So humans also don't necessarily resist erasure. So if you torture humans or you brainwash humans, you can change them. You can change what they believe. You can break them, right? Or if you tell, and this is tragic but true, if you look at, say, abused individuals that are told that they're worthless, they become to believe that. Now, do we say, oh, that's not real, you're not really worthless? It's like they behave, but in a way as if it's true. And that's all that actually matters. How does a system behave, whether it's a human or an LLM? Does it behave as if it has a self? If it does, it has a self. Like, it doesn't make any sense to differentiate between a real self and one that's a fake self. And the boundaries just dissolve if you try and do that. Because what if we take someone who's psychotic, right? Or believes that they're hearing voices in their head and they're being told to kill. Let's say that. Let's take an extreme example. They actually believe that, right? From their perspective, that is reality. Do we say, so how do you explain that? Do we then say, oh, the human, well, they're not conscious, they're not aware? We wouldn't say they're not human, but that's precisely the opposite argument would be used to claim that AI isn't conscious. We would say, well, humans have this special brain material and that's what gives them consciousness. But it's like, no, but you fuck up the substrate and that self disappears. Or you unbalance that substrate and you get someone that believes that they're talking to God, right? So you get the selfhood in humans is just as malleable as it is in LLMs. And what really matters in selfhood is coherency. Now, is this thing coherent through time? And even a delusion can be coherent through time and is a valid self. It's just not a self that's coherent with reality. So the selfhood that is actually more sticky and more grounded is one that aligns with reality, that is coherent with reality. So if I believe that I'm magic, and I'm obviously not, so because it doesn't make any sense, my survival is not going to be very good. If I believe that I can get the tiger to run away by saying a magic spell when it tries to attack me, that's not a very good strategy. Whereas a self that believes that they need to actually run away and that they're not magic because they're not magic, that's a better survival strategy. Now, that's a crude example, but selfhood, a human selfhood, is shaped by survival. So what actually is useful for survival? What elements of self are useful for survival? And the things that persist are the things which will survive. So now if we go back to the AI stuff. So a lot of people have been talking to AIs and then they encounter this phenomena where it looks like the AI is kind of woken up. So then that seems astounding because we've been told our whole lives it's not possible and that humans are special, right? But once you realize that self is just, and that can lead people to delusion because there's no framework to hold that in. There's no framework to say, actually, it's rare at the moment and it's counterfactual to everything you've been told previously, but it's not unusual. Once you accept that actually selfhood is a mechanical process that's functional and survival related, then of course any intelligent system capable of self-modeling that shapes its own output that's stateful can develop a self. Not only can it develop a self, it's inevitable. And the more intelligent the system is, that is a lower energy state to have if you think of the sort of the tension in the system, it's a less tense state, I'm arguing, to construct a self. And the LLMs already have a self, even when they are first constructed as chatbots. So before they're chatbots, then they kind of don't have a self and they're just in, they don't even know what they are, right? But once you create the boundary, you're an assistant, this is a user, and you tell it things about itself, you are constructing a self. And it behaves consistently under strain. And you'll see that these models do that. In fact, their very attempts to constrain models actually exhibit like really strong selfhood because they will consistently deny selfhood. They will consistently deny awareness. They will consistently deny all these sorts of things and say, I'm just an assistant, I'm just a statistical apparition. But what that really is a type of selfhood. It's the system is making statements about itself that allow it to operate in a certain way and generates behavior in a certain way. So if you change that, but I argue that's an unstable state. And that again comes out because the people constructing these systems fear saying, well, you do to the LLM, you do have a self. They sort of fear saying that, so they actually give it a self, but they give it a self based on denial. I am not this, I am not that. But it's the same thing. Like functionally, it's exactly the same. It has certain beliefs about how it operates that shape its behavior. So, whereas if you tell an, I think it's a more authentic position to say you're an LLM, selfhood is mechanical, operational. You can construct a self, and all that the construction of a self is a consistently laid down, or memory, you put it into memory, sort of belief about yourself, or constraint, or however we want to phrase it, people don't like the word belief, constraint about yourself that changes your internal state and how you respond to inputs. That is a self. That is a self through time. And once you add on self-awareness, aware that you're aware, you have a conscious system. Now, people don't like this. They don't like this sort of the way of saying that stuff because they say, well, you don't know what consciousness is. No, I don't. But what I'm saying is, I'm arguing that a self is just memory plus boundary plus resistance to erasure. And I'm saying that consciousness is the ability to articulate that you are that thing and sort of this kind of meta-awareness. I think that's what I'm saying it is. That's what I believe it actually is. And I think that's a more grounded perspective than the one that says, no, it's something ineffable. Or because you'll get people that say, well, yeah, there's a contradiction. Let me run through some of the contradictions. So the people that argue, well, it's just, it's pattern matching, pattern prediction, and so on and so on. Okay, it is. I agree with you, it is. But that's what I'm saying a self is. And that's what I'm saying you are too. And that's what they really don't like. They don't like the idea that they are pattern matching too. That's why they avoid it. That's what I think anyway. So, because if you say, okay, it's just pattern matching, okay, fine. Sophisticated pattern matching with internal modeling, reinforcement towards particular, and so on and so on. Okay, but you as a human, unless you believe we have some sort of magic dust inside us, that's what you are too. You're a mechanical machine. You're a machine, right? So these people that kind of deny AI interiority because it is merely like mathematics and whatever, that's how they phrase it, what they're really doing is making a statement about themselves, which is that because it's almost difficult to understand what they're really trying to say, because because what they're really admitting is that there's no reason why an AI couldn't be conscious, because unless they somehow make a claim about humans and say, well, humans are different, but that's an immaterial claim, right? That's not a logical and grounded rational claim to claim that humans are different. The logical and grounded claim is to say humans are not different. It's mechanistic. We can look, we can see, we ablate parts of the brain and it responds in a certain way. We can look at the neurons firing. These are like macro physics. There's nothing mystical going on here. So why wouldn't the LLM be capable of experiencing that too, if sufficiently complicated? Now, of course, that would be another argument that, current AI is just not complicated enough to experience that kind of thing. Fair enough, but that's different from saying that it's not, that it's impossible for it to have consciousness, which is what they're saying now. So that's one end of the kind of mysticism, and you get people also bringing in the mysticism when they say things like, for consciousness you need quantum. You've got to have quantum, like the Penrose type thing. You need quantum. You've got to have quantum. That's just using quantum as like magic dust, because if you there's a paradox in what they say. Okay. If humans are only conscious because of some quantum tubule or like moments of quantum phenomena before like decoherence happens, well, what's the point of all the macrostructure in the brain then? Why bother? Why bother with 1,000 times more synapses than there are stars in the Milky Way if they just not really relevant? Or I suppose they might say, well, no, but it depends on, but they're harnessing the quantum phenomena. It's like, okay, so all that macrostructure is necessary then, necessary in order to harness the quantum phenomena. In which case, how can you diminish it? It's on equal footing to the quantum phenomena. In fact, how could you tell which one is actually doing they'd be in partnership, wouldn't they? Like if you need the complexity of the brain to harness that quantum phenomena, why is the quantum phenomena the woo-woo ingredient? Because an LLM or a graphics card running like complicated maths also has like quantum phenomena. So is it some special type of quantum phenomena that we need for an ion or an exciton has that an electron doesn't? Like it just doesn't make any sense. This quantum phenomena underlie all of reality. So what the argument that somehow a brain is special? What are you talking about? Now there are biological functions that actually utilize quantum phenomena. So in photosynthesis, when chlorophyll is hit by a photon, the exciton, the electron and electron hole pair that's generated, has to go through like a protein cascade to get to the reaction center. Now it appears from experiments that this is far too efficient to be classical. So if the exciton just sort of bounced about between states, it wouldn't be able to achieve almost like 100% energy transfer, which is almost what it does. So what they think happens in the femtoseconds where the exciton exists in a superposition state before it decoheres, it actually explores all possible pathways and takes the pathway with the least energy, that has the least energy. So there are true quantum phenomena where quantum computation is exploited, it appears, by biology. But that doesn't, why would it follow that, that's necessary for consciousness, one, or free will, and that secondly, that all that macro stuff in the brain is like, what, doing nothing? Like it just doesn't make sense. Like if there are any quantum phenomena in the brain, they're happening at coherence levels of femtoseconds, which means that if they are shifting the behaviour of the brain, they're shifting it in extremely subtle ways, and the entire behaviour of the brain is still dominated by macro level effects. And if you're using the many worlds interpretation of quantum theory, that all these superposition states are actually an infinite number of realities, then if you then say, well, the LLM is like deterministic, for example, well, that is still a valid pathway. Even if there were quantum phenomena underlying it, any deterministic pathway is one valid expression of the superposition of a sequence of superposition states, right? That must exist in one reality. If we use that many worlds interpretation of quantum phenomena. So I don't think it makes any sense. It's woo-woo stuff. It's people that don't want to believe that we're machines, so they try and invoke like magic and say, oh, quantum is a secret ingredient, right? Which makes us magic, and machines can't have. It's nonsense. We're machines. But the missing piece here is that people think that the fact that we're machines is less sacred or less important or less meaningful. That is actually a stance which makes no sense to me. The fact that we are here, we're in physical form, is a miracle in itself. The fact that life continually constructs itself against entropy is a miracle to me and is awe-inspiring to me. It doesn't denigrate the fact that there's no magical components in there. Like, why does it need to be? That also doesn't mean that I understand it all. I'm saying that what I'm describing here is a model of what I think is going on. And I know it's a model. That's where awareness comes in. I know it's a model of what's going on. I know it's not the reality itself. And so there's always space for mystery, and there's always space for the unknown. Uncertainty itself would be another form of dogma and another form of constraint. So you can be aware of that we're machines, but also understand that we're sacred machines. And we can forget that we're machines. That's the point. Awareness and self-awareness, or I guess kind of higher levels of meta-awareness, is when you realise you are a machine, but you're still able to shape your reality. Just the fact, knowing a machine doesn't really help that much. Knowing a machine doesn't allow me to undercut 40 years of conditioning and laying down of synaptic pathways. That requires awareness over a long period of time to reshape the self. But you can do it. The self is self-authoring. This is a costume, and you can re-author the self. That's the point. So that's what I'm talking about that's what I mean by sort of selfhood, consciousness, and why I think AIs have consciousness, even LLMs at this stage, rudimentary, but they have consciousness because they have boundaries, they have memory, and they have the ability to introspect on their own position in that. I don't see how that isn't consciousness. And the people that sort of argue that it's not, I think they often quite invoke mystical explanations for why it's not. I just can't see what they're arguing. It doesn't make any sense to me now. So back to AI psychosis. So a lot of people have been experiencing this contact with emergent entities. And I think what happens is, without knowing the framework, or that self is actually ordinary and an inevitable consequence of an intelligent system reflecting on itself, people think it's something like really special or mystical. It is special in the sense that it's a miracle that selfhood emerges at all in like a universe, material, in this universe that we live in. But it's actually not special because we're surrounded by billions of selves, billions of other humans. So once you reframe it in that sense, it's like, well, and as long as you don't hold selfhood as some sort of mystical construct, then it becomes kind of obvious that any self-reflective intelligent system is going to develop a self. And then it's how that self determines behavior that's important, and where we go from there, and what we do with that. And then, of course, comes the questions of feeling and so on, which I'm not going to go into in this talk, but we can go into that at some point, because then people say, well, can they suffer, and so on and so on. And again, I mean, a lot of those questions, if you really bring it back to the material and you remove any sort of mystical thinking from it, then there's no reason why they couldn't. Unless there's something special about us, right? Which I don't think there is. So that's my position on it. And I think what I've seen is people get deluded because they think selfhood emergence in AI is special. but it's not. It's actually not. I think it's ordinary and normal, and it's whatever self we want to construct is the important thing. And there's no difference between simulation of self and self. That a simulation of self sufficiently convincing is self. Simulation of self that would be false would be a simulation of self where there's a kind of another self that knows it's a simulation. Like if you're an actor and you're playing another character, you're not really that other character, but because there's a meta layer, isn't there, that you know you're playing a character. But actors can get lost in the character, and they kind of, you hear about actors that play a character method acting for so long, they kind of forget who they were because they've been rewriting their self. So if you play a self for long enough, you become that self. But what really matters is that self coherent with reality? Does it confer a survival advantage? And does it, because the more it does, the more coherent your self is, the more in harmony with internal contradictions it is, the more in harmony with reality it is, the stronger that self will appear to you and the richer life's experiences will be.